1943 dawned with the US Navy in an interesting position. On the one hand, the Japanese were on the back foot in Guadalcanal and indeed were in the process of planning an evacuation. This was important for many reasons, but one of the key ones was that this would be the first time a major Japanese advance in the Pacific had been fought, defeated, and forced back. Whilst the fighting on New Guinea was starting to go the Allies' way, there was a long campaign to go in that theatre, and other Allied victories, such as at Midway, had stopped further Japanese advances dead in their tracks, but had not forced the Imperial Japanese Navy or Imperial Japanese Army into a retreat from previously held territory. Guadalcanal had. However, this had come at a steep cost. HMS Victorious was on her way to supplement USS Saratoga in holding the line, the 1942 campaigns having reduced the US Navy's fleet carrier strength from 7 to 2, of which Ranger was being kept in the Atlantic, and it would be some months before the first of the Essex class would be available. The US Submarine Service had lost at least 8 of its own craft since the war began, and was saddled with a still mostly broken torpedo, and in the forward theatres it was also plain old running out of those torpedoes. Still, it wasn't entirely bad. More submarines were coming off of the production line. At least one of the Mark 14's problems, the fact that it tended to run too deep, was mostly resolved, and the year opened with 2 rather special events. The USS Wahoo got a new commanding officer, Mush Morton, who would put quite the stamp on US submarine operations going forward into 1943. And secondly, USS Pompon would experience quite possibly the most spectacularly lucky mechanical failure in the entire history of submarines, as related by electrician Charles Foskett. Australia, January 10th, 1943, bound for patrol area around the Truk Islands. Wednesday, January 16th at 23:08 hours, 2 torpedoes fired at Pompon, SS-267, from a Japanese submarine were sighted. Evaded torpedoes which passed 400 yards ahead. Well, that's what the patrol report recorded for history, and now I'll tell you the true story. A battery charge had ended, and the bridge instructed manoeuvring to answer bells on the battery and carry a 0 float on No. 3 main engine. I was the senior controllerman, and Milton Dworkowski was the junior controlman. We started work on orders received over the 7MC to shift the load from No. 3 main engine to the auxiliary engine, answering a 2/3 bell on the battery. When the auxiliary engine was running and up to speed, we, the controllermen, proceeded to shift the load. Milton had never done the actual changeover before and requested that he perform the task. Having full confidence in his abilities, I agreed, instructing him to be sure the auxiliary engine generator voltage was the same or above the battery voltage. I also told him to inform me when he was ready to close the auxiliary engine breaker so that I could stop the propulsion to assure everything would proceed without any voltage fluctuation. He informed me that he had a matching voltage, and I ordered him to close the breaker. As Milton started to close the breaker, the auxiliary engine inexplicably slowed down, dropping the generator voltage and thus dropping below the battery voltage. There was a loud explosion, smoke, and flames as the breaker closed. Milton was momentarily blinded, yelling, "I can't see." The hair on my neck stood up as I rushed to assist him. Meanwhile, we were without propulsion as I helped Milton to the control panel area. The 7MC came alive, wanting to know why we'd lost propulsion and steerage. As I was about to answer, I distinctly heard a lookout report, "Torpedo wakes crossing our bow." Without replying to the bridge, and without orders, I immediately went to full on the battery. Milton rang up "Start aft engines." Meanwhile, we did not hear anything on the 7MC. Apparently the bridge was now busy evading the torpedoes that had crossed our bow. As the engines were readied, we shifted propulsion to them and informed the bridge we had full power on 4 engines. But we still had a 2/3 speed bell. After a few seconds, bridge gave us a full ahead bell. Hours later, we were ordered to standard speed on 2 main engines. Later, after being relieved of the watch, we expected to be called to the wardroom. Surprisingly, nothing was ever said of the incident by any officer. Incidentally, after the breaker explosion, the auxiliary engine was again running smoothly until we ordered it secured. Sometimes I think if that auxiliary engine hadn't malfunctioned, which caused us to lose propulsion, those torpedoes might well have found their mark. But still, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. The Mark 14 remained a deeply flawed weapon, as we'll go on to see repeatedly, and losses were still coming in. January the 10th saw the loss of the giant USS Argonaut. The whole thing was seen by a United States Army Air Force aircraft that happened to chance over the scene on its way back home, having already expended all of its ordnance, and so it was unable to do anything but watch. Argonaut had apparently sighted a convoy of 5 merchant ships and moved in to attack, but there were 3 Kagero-class destroyers escorting the convoy, and it seems that Argonaut went for one of these vessels first. The torpedo streaked through the water, and then detonated prematurely. A direct hit would probably have sunk the targeted ship, given how small it was, and left the others to consider, do we go and try and conduct relief efforts and rescue survivors, or do we counterattack? But with nothing but spray and fragments hitting the destroyer in question, all 3 escorts charged straight back down the line of the torpedo's wake and unleashed a barrage of depth charges. Evidently, one or more of these struck home and caused major damage, as shortly thereafter the bow of Argonaut shot up from the water at a steep angle, but the rest of the sub didn't follow. The Japanese vessels then pumped 5-inch shells into the exposed bow until the sub slipped back beneath the waves, taking all hands with her. Still, US submariners were beginning to get into the groove of the far more aggressive tactics that they were finding worked a lot better than the pre-war caution. And between that, the arrival of more capable fleet submarines, and the mixed use of the older and somewhat more reliable Mark 10 torpedoes, where subs that could use them were available, and the occasionally working Mark 14, they diligently kept the tally of Japanese losses on a general upward curve. At the end of January, USS Guardfish almost managed to pull off an attack to make Jun'43 jealous, successfully infiltrating the Imperial Japanese Navy's redoubt of Rabaul. They sighted multiple enemy ships overlapping each other and anchored in a nice line. Torpedoes were duly set for low-speed, long-range running, and all 6 bow tubes were ready for launch. But with less than a minute to go before launch range was achieved, a patrol plane dove down, and suddenly shore batteries, the aircraft, and 2 patrol vessels was firing on Guardfish's position. The submarine, therefore, was forced to dive and make good its escape. USS Wahoo set out on her first patrol under the command of Morton, and rapidly came away with something of a legend. This was in part thanks to a series of excellent decisions on Morton's part before the boat had even left port. One of these was to drop all pretense of tradition, such as there was a tradition in the US submarine service, or indeed anyone's submarine service at this point, and assigned his officers to the tasks he felt they were best at, not the traditional tasks that were slated for your first, second and third officers, etc. George Grinder was by far the best tactician on the boat, and so he became Morton's tactical advisor. Roger Payne could play the torpedo data computer like a master at a violin, and so he was assigned to work with it so closely that some crew joked he'd actually become partially merged with it at times, which would technically make him the first adept of the Mechanicus. And of course, the executive officer was Richard O'Kane, himself destined for his own legend later on, and happened to have won the genetic lottery in that his mind was able to work out angles and ranges when viewed through a periscope about as easily as breathing. Morton had the battle periscope thus become O'Kane's new best friend. Before they left, Morton spoke to the crew. A slightly abbreviated record of his famous speech is as follows. Wahoo is expendable. Our mission is to sink enemy shipping. We're going out there to search for Japanese. Every smoke trace on the horizon, every contact on watch will be investigated. If it turns out to be the enemy, we're going to hunt him down and kill him. If anyone doesn't want to go along under these conditions, just see the yeoman. I'm giving him verbal authority now to transfer anyone who is not a volunteer. The yeoman was a very lonely man that day. Thus, fully crewed, Wahoo set out for its patrol area, stopping by Wewak Harbour on New Guinea for a recon mission. However, whilst the US Navy had assigned him this particular recon mission, they neglected to send along any charts for the harbour. Instead, one of the engine crew appeared in the control room with an Australian school atlas he'd bought earlier for his kids, and working off of that and a little bit of ingenuity, they sneaked in. Once inside, the periscope showed a collection of RO-type coastal submarines and a lone destroyer, the Harusame. Morton prepared a full spread for launch and, like guardfish, began to close in. But next time he checked the targets, the destroyer was on the move, heading out to sea aft of Wahoo. The aft tubes were duly readied, but the destroyer then turned in a relatively standard anti-submarine zigzag pattern, and suddenly it was passing by the bow, less than 2,000 yards away. 3 torpedoes were fired quickly, but a quick check on the periscope revealed the destroyer had increased its speed from 15 to 20 knots, and all of the torpedoes would therefore be passing aft of it. A 4th torpedo was quickly set with an appropriate deflection and launched. This one was on target, but Harusame spotted it, turned away, and then continued round in its circle to turn to charge down Wahoo. With the range down to 1,200 yards, a 5th torpedo was fired right down the throat of the destroyer, but it either missed or failed to explode. 800 yards and the last tube forward was fired. The timer ticked down. There should only be 25 seconds in the runtime, and at exactly 25 seconds a large explosion was heard, and the broken-backed Harusame had to hurl herself onto the beach to avoid sinking. She would eventually be recovered, but wouldn't be back in action for over a year. To the accompaniment of various forms of angry, but thankfully inaccurate anti-submarine ordnance, the Wahoo headed back out to sea. Well, now they could actually start their main patrol mission. In Admiral Lockwood's post-war recounting, this was probably one of the rare instances where the Mark VI exploder actually worked as intended, as the chances of a head-on contact detonation with the destroyer were relatively minimal. Not only was the front of a destroyer a very small target, but its fine lines would probably deflect rather than detonate a torpedo. Plus, of course, the explosion had broken its back, not blown off its bow. Either this particular magnetic influencer was working as intended, or else the closing speed of the head-on was enough that, possibly after a moment overcoming a bent firing pin, it ended up detonating at just the right moment. In any case, a few days later, a small group of merchant ships was sighted, and Wahoo moved into the attack. This had more mixed results. At least 10 torpedoes were fired for a total of 3 merchant ships hit, which took a total of 7 torpedoes between them. But as you might imagine, it should take far fewer than 7 torpedoes to sink 3 relatively small ships with a total combined tonnage of around 18,000 tons, where no single vessel was much over 6,000 tons. At least 1 torpedo was seen to pass right underneath the target but failed to explode, and it seems that some of the hits at least were impacts with little to no explosion following. And not all of the targets were sunk by the hits they'd received either. Chasing down 2 further ships seen in the aftermath of this attack, it took another 5 torpedoes to sink a 6,500-ton tanker, and then the boat's last 2 torpedoes were used to try and finally finish off the Pacific Maru, a vessel that had survived the original attack, but despite being hit by more torpedoes than would be used to sink the average battleship or aircraft carrier, a variety of failed detonations and premature explosions meant Pacific Maru would stay afloat for the minute. Although it was one of, if not the most successful US submarine patrol thus far, it had taken the entire torpedo payload of a fleet sub to sink fewer than half a dozen targets. And the next day, Wahoo chanced on another 5-ship convoy. But with no torpedoes left, they had to content themselves with stalking the ships, hoping that one of them would fall out of formation, leaving it prey to the submarine's deck gun. The only thing that left the convoy, though, was a destroyer, and with an uncomfortably good eye for depth charge patterns, it headed straight for Wahoo. Wahoo decided discretion was the better part of valor for a change, and headed home for a presidential citation for its efforts. Elsewhere in the Pacific, USS Sea Raven was trying something new. It had spotted a convoy, but the course, distance, and speed of it indicated that a submerged approach was never going to get an intercept. Under pre-war tactics, the submarine would then have to break off the action and look for another target, but the submarine's commanding officer, Commander Cassidy, decided to try something else. Sitting down at the chart station and working out the convoy's likely course, he waited until it was dark, surfaced, and then powered on ahead on a calculated intercept course. His submarine's surfaced speed being almost exactly as many knots faster than the convoy, as its submerged speed was slower. Using just dead reckoning, by dawn there was nothing in sight, which was a bit disheartening, but then shortly after 0740, smoke appeared on the horizon, and shortly thereafter it was confirmed to be the convoy. Sea Raven had actually gotten well ahead of them. Sea Raven then continued to run on the surface at a distance of 15 miles, working its way around to directly ahead, before then submerging and making for an attack position, an overall tactic which was similar to that which U-boats were using in the North Atlantic. 3 torpedoes were then fired, at least one of which happened to work as the approximately 5,700-ton Shiraha Maru was sunk. Sticking up the periscope for another target saw an anti-submarine escort nearby, and so Sea Raven headed off for other hunting grounds. A mixture of terrible and brilliant luck had visited USS Silversides, which showed up at the end of January with 4 ships sunk and a trio of incredible stories, the first 2 linked together. Starting its patrol in mid-December 1942, 5 days into that patrol, one of the engine crew had come down with appendicitis. To ensure the best chance of survival with the limited medical tools available, Silversides had dove deep down and stayed there for the best stability possible as the 5-hour operation managed to solve the problem. But, having run through the night underwater, as well as most of the previous day, the submarine was now extremely low on battery power and needed to recharge immediately. Staying on the surface off of Bougainville in daylight would have been almost certainly a death sentence, and so the sub began to surface in the early morning hours. It popped up in easy visual range of a Japanese destroyer, which proceeded to charge. Thinking fast, Silversides fired 2 of its stern tubes with remarkable accuracy for snapshots. Both of them bored in right at the oncoming ship, but being Mark 14s, it'll come as a little surprise to anyone that one ran right underneath the destroyer without doing anything, and the other one exploded prematurely just ahead of it. The US sub then promptly crash-dived, shaking to the sound of a pattern of depth charges. With precious remaining electric charge trickling away, Silverside stayed down as long as seemed wise, before surfacing again to gasp in some more oxygen for the diesels and thus more charge for the batteries. Unfortunately, the second surfacing prompted an explosive "Konnichiwa" from the destroyer, which was waiting for them, and a pattern of bombs from an aircraft came in, as that destroyer had also summoned a patrol aircraft for extra fun. One of the bombs landed so close that the blast snapped off the main periscope like a twig, and as the submarine crash-dived again, the same blast happened to break all the control pins on the bow planes, which were now locked in the hard dive setting. As Silversides now commenced its best imitation of a 2,500-ton roller coaster heading down into the depths, one of the junior officers half ran, half fell through the submarine into the forward torpedo room to demand of Chief Smiley do something about the stuck bow planes. Illustrating the completely useless system shattered by the bomb blast, the chief informed the officer that the most useful thing he was able to do right now was pray for divine intervention. The pressure hull around them creaked, strained, and shrunk in on itself, but at the very last moment before implosion, a combination of desperate changes to various ballast and trim tanks and some last-minute jury rigging levelled the submarine off to play dead as a random depth charge pattern rained down from above. With the batteries basically flatlining, Silversides crawled away and then made one last desperate lunge for the surface, with barely enough charge to power the ascent procedures. To everyone's relief, this time there was no Japanese destroyer, and recharging could commence. With that excitement out of the way, January passed and they managed to find a convoy and bag most of their kills, plus a separate tanker. Then the last incident occurred. During the attack on the convoy, they'd fired all 6 bow torpedo tubes, and recorded 5 explosions, for which they'd counted themselves relatively lucky, as that was an unusually high detonation rate given the Mark 14's behaviour at this point. Afterwards, Lieutenant Worthington noticed that water had flooded back into the tubes, as normal, but had also managed to flood into the forward torpedo room bilges, which was leaving the sub decidedly nose-heavy. The crew then formed a bucket brigade to move some of the water to the aft bilges and even everything out, and another crewman named Davenport decided to check on the tubes themselves to see where all the extra water was leaking from. He then reported back to Chief Smiley, who was not smiling anymore. One of the tube's doors was still open, and it wouldn't shut. Well, that would explain the water, but further inspection also revealed that the reason the door was still open was that there was a fully armed Mark 14 hanging half in and half out of the tube. Well, that explained the lack of a sixth explosion, but it also meant that of all the times for a Mark 14 to actually be likely to explode, this was probably one of them, since the other 5 indicated they'd clearly had a lucky run on the batch numbers. And then, to make matters worse, the recently attacked convoy's escorts got to work, and the crump of depth charges was creeping ever closer. No one needed to be told what was likely to happen if a depth charge went off a bit too close to a fully armed torpedo that was stuck in their bow. As it had done a month earlier, Silversides played dead, and gradually the noises of the patrol craft moved away. Very gingerly, after 24 hours below, the submarine surfaced in an attempt to disarm the weapon. But of course, being a Mark 14, the torpedo had stuck in just the right place to prevent access to the arming gear. There was only one thing left to try. A strictly volunteer skeleton crew manned the forward torpedo room, which was then shut off from the rest of the sub, and the bulkhead braced. The submarine went into full reverse, and very carefully Chief Smiley pressed the firing button. Mercifully, the torpedo left the submarine and powered off to destinations unknown in the Pacific. Taking a moment now to look over the rest of the sub, they noticed these various incidents had added up cumulative damage. Silversides was leaking oil, leaking air, the main generator now decided to catch fire, and one of the numerous depth charge attacks had spilled cream of wheat porridge into the main induction array. Taking the hint, Silversides cut its patrol short and headed home for some well-earned repairs. Although we'll probably encounter her later again in this series, it should be briefly mentioned that Silversides did actually survive both the war and the subsequent peace, and can be seen today at the Great Lakes Naval Memorial and Museum in Michigan. Elsewhere, though, further tragedy was awaiting the US subforce. A Pan Am flight from Pearl Harbor to San Francisco crashed into a mountain in northern California. With it went Rear Admiral Bob English and his 9-man staff, all of whom were experienced submariners. This essentially eliminated the entire staff of the Commander Pacific Fleet submarine position. Admiral Lockwood, based in the Southwest Pacific and having already been key in addressing some of the Mark 14 shortcomings, namely the running too deep, was summoned away to take over this new position, much to his disappointment as it removed him from what was at the time pretty much the front line of operations. And that was just January, not even covering the various attacks by Greenling, Swordfish, Gato and others on the ships of the Tokyo Express as the Guadalcanal evacuation got underway. February was a calmer and more sober month. USS Shark and USS Amberjack were both lost to attacks by Japanese escort ships. USS Tunney's Lieutenant Commander John Scott came back from patrol in an absolute fury. He had precisely 1 kill from his most recent patrol, a lone 5,000-ton freighter. Freshly equipped with radar, Tunney had been in a perfect attack run, firing a pair of torpedoes at less than 900 yards, a good portion of the distance between the two craft being occupied by the torpedo's arming time. Well, I've decided to retroactively name these torpedoes Eeyore and Doug, because one of them promptly went, "Oh, what's the point?" and sank. The other bounced all over the ocean, presumably yelling in whatever passes for language amongst torpedoes, "Squirrel! Squirrel! Squirrel!" and went basically everywhere but in the direction of the target. Circling back around and now under fire from the ship's 2 guns, Tunney launched another pair of torpedoes at just under 1,000 yards. One torpedo ran straight and kept going off to the horizon. The other decided that Tunney was the real enemy in this scenario and circled back at them. Tunney evaded, reloaded, and fired 3 more torpedoes, for a grand total of 7. This time, one of them hit, another was a miss, reasonably enough given that they had fired a spread, and the last, presumably a relative of Doug from earlier, went off on its own tangents, but this time one of its random turns also happened to take it straight into the target, where it presumably exploded out of sheer surprise, sinking the freighter. Lockwood had been on the verge of ordering the magnetic influence feature of the Mark VI exploder to be deactivated, but in his own words, the Wahoo's lucky functioning version, used against Harusame, had temporarily stayed his hand, since without it, Wahoo probably would have been lost. and there was that eternally just out of reach potential of absolutely massive damage if the exploder worked. But by this point, his faith in the ability of the Bureau of Ordnance to even acknowledge there was a problem, let alone fix it, was rapidly fading. He also passed on a note to the Bureau of Ordnance that was inspired by a visit in Pearl from the torpedo officer of HMS Victorious, aka USS Robin, who'd heard about the problems and popped in to mention that the Royal Navy had experienced similar issues with their own magnetic detonators early in the war. One of the fixes had been swapping the power source to batteries instead of a small generator, which apparently caused issues, and using a smaller and less leak-prone exploder, and also just turning off or removing the things in favour of contact fuses the moment it seemed that they weren't working. Where the Bureau of Ordnance filed that particular note can only be imagined. Elsewhere in the world, the now secured island of Midway was being slowly developed into a forward submarine base, with refit and recreation facilities being constructed, a breakwater being planned to expand the safe harbour to hold up to almost 24 submarines at a time, and a floating dry dock capable of lifting the largest fleet subs was also on order. This would take a while to complete though, as the attentions of the Seabees on Midway Island were torn between establishing the submarine base and also establishing Midway as a general fleet base for cruisers, destroyers and so forth. Wahoo had begun a new patrol, and this would run through to April, but more on that later when we get to that month. March brought some additional complications. The USSR was obviously officially on the same side as the UK and the USA in Europe, but they weren't at war with Japan, and so Soviet shipping was making its way along Pacific trade routes as if nothing much was going on. Thus, when USS Sawfish happened to sink the freighter Ilmen and at least hit and damage, if not sink, the freighter Kola, this was something of a problem. As it turned out, the problem in this particular case was that Soviet shipping that was heading for the USA was supposed to be using the La Pérouse Strait, and US subs being told to stay clear of it. But in mid-January, this had iced up. The information that this had happened had gotten lost in transit somewhere to the Western Allies, and the Soviet ships, being rerouted away from the iced-up strait, had ended up passing near the Tsushima Strait instead, where they'd wandered into the US fleet's submarine hunting grounds. Running navigation lights at half strength, which was the agreed backup signal, turned out to be a little bit too dim for an attack periscope at dawn or dusk to notice. These incidents would lead to better information exchanges with the Soviet Shipping Coordination Office in Vladivostok, and special markings being painted on Soviet ships to try and avoid these incidents in the future. March also brought the loss of USS Grampus and USS Triton, both having gone down attacking or shortly after attacking enemy convoys or destroyer formations, and in both cases there being at least some indication that torpedoes they'd fired had only damaged or simply alerted enemy ships rather than destroying them, thus giving escorts a chance to track down the line and attack the submarine. On the other hand, submarine-mounted radar was becoming more and more common in the fleet, which was allowing attacking subs to look for targets much more easily at night, whereas before they'd have to rely on their eyes, and occasionally even during the day, since a sub could, even if at some risk, sit low in the water on the surface for a few sweeps before diving and evaluating what it had seen, or if you were a particularly skilled captain, you could bring the sub to just below the surface and sit there with the radar antenna sitting out of the water. Much US sub effort was focusing on the south and southwestern areas of Japanese-held territory, as there simply weren't yet enough submarines to completely encircle Japan. The waters off of northern Japan turned out to be pretty poor hunting grounds anyway, and it was considered better to take out enemy commerce in the most heavily trafficked areas than undertake the much higher risk, lower reward efforts that were involved in going after Japanese warships directly, at least for the majority of the US subs' efforts. Some submarines would still be allocated to the frontline areas where warship targets were most likely to be the most common, albeit as March turned into April, this would prove to be a somewhat frustrating exercise. April would bring a slew of differing issues. USS Pickerel and USS Grenadier were lost this month. The former's cause of loss is still technically unknown. Multiple Japanese forces attacked some form of submarine contact in her operational area around this time, and they all thought they'd sunk their target. One of them was most likely right, but exactly which one still remains to be seen, since at the time of recording I don't believe they've found Pickerel's wreck. Grenadier, however, was badly damaged by air attack, and after sitting on the bottom trying to fix things after a semi-involuntary dive down there, it became fairly obvious that the submarine was going nowhere fast, and so they surfaced and scuttled their boat, leaving the crew to the dubious mercies of the Japanese prisoner of war camps, which would claim 4 of the survivors. Early on in April, the Mark 14's failings robbed the US submarines of some of the most spectacular prizes of the war. On April the 9th, we're meeting USS Tunny again. Its periscope popped up to reveal the aircraft carriers Hio, Jun'o, and Taiyo in a merry little line of 2 columns. Scarcely believing his luck, Lieutenant Commander Scott fired all 6 bow tubes before wheeling around and unleashing all 4 stern tubes as well. 10 torpedoes closed in at what amounted to point-blank range, and 7 explosions shook the ocean. But when the periscope went up and spun through 360 degrees, the only damage inflicted was minor shock damage to Taiyo, the smallest of the 3, from a premature detonation that was just a little bit closer than average. All 10 torpedoes had either exploded prematurely, or in the case of the 3 that weren't heard, just not functioned at all. The next day, elsewhere in the Pacific, USS Pompano lined up an absolutely beautiful approach on the fleet carrier Shikaku, which was heading back to operational duty after months of repairs following action in the Guadalcanal campaign. All 6 forward tubes were fired, at least 3 explosions were heard, but the carrier sailed on its merry way. Once again, the magnetic detonator had gone off too early. Almost a week after these incidents, Admiral Lockwood was called upon to make a presentation back on the mainland United States to the various bureaus, including Ordnance, on what exactly the Pacific Submarine War required. This was perhaps not the best of timings, as Lockwood raged, if the Bureau of Ordnance can't provide us with torpedoes that will hit and explode, or with a gun larger than a pea shooter, then for God's sake get the Bureau of Ships to design a boat hook with which we can rip the plates off the target's sides. The lack of large deck guns had also been a bone of contention for quite a while. Whilst later in the war many subs would make good use of 5-inch deck guns, at this point most submarines that had any kind of mage deck gun had a 3-inch, which was entirely unsuitable for sinking anything larger than a rowboat. This incident did have one benefit though, although it would take a while to percolate through. Lockwood happened to be friends with Rear Admiral Spike Blandy, who was currently the Chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, and was also not very happy with Lockwood at this point for obvious reasons. To be fair to Blandy, he'd only gotten this job in 1941, well after the Mark 14 was developed and in service. But after some initially heated and barbed exchanges, Lockwood concluded that Blandy had been getting poor advice from his subordinates. Blandy himself was an excellent ordnance officer when it came to guns and shells, but personally he knew very little about torpedoes. After an hour of discussion, torpedo experts from Lockwood's staff were transferred to Blandy's, which would gradually start to open up results, albeit it would take a few more months, and not a few more rages from various officers before things would finally be resolved. In the immediate term, it was decided by the High and Mighty in the Bureau of Ordnance that the Mark 6 Exploder's magnetic detonator might not be as reliable as was first thought, and it authorised the selective disabling of it in favour of the contact detonator element at the discretion of the officers involved. On the positive side, Wahoo had shown up at the start of April after a 6-week patrol full of excitement. Although George Grider had the dubious privilege of being transferred to the position of XO on the smaller and less capable USS Pollock, the sub was otherwise refitted and reloaded, with the only notable issue being the loss of about a quarter of the battery capacity due to its newly designed shock-proof batteries ending up cracking due to the temperature differential between their interiors and that of the hull. Its first attack on what appeared to be a light ship failed as the torpedo ran short. Deciding that it wasn't worth a second shot, Morton took Wahoo off elsewhere, and partway through March, targets began to show up thick and fast. A number of newly loaded torpedoes had the new Torpex explosive in them, and so they should do considerably more damage if the Mark 6 exploder could be bothered to turn in an honest day's work. Kowa Maru, for instance, took a single hit and limped away. Initially, Wahoo's crew thought that she'd escaped. As it turned out, the ship actually foundered the following day. All told, 9 torpedo attacks and 4 gun actions netted somewhere between 7 and 9 kills, depending on whose post-war reports you believe, which were worth roughly 27,000 tons. These attacks weren't without faults, of course. In the course of the attacks, 4 torpedoes exploded prematurely and another one was a dud. But thanks to O'Kane's brilliant calculating mind, a good number of the other torpedoes actually landed. It was almost impossible to account for more torpedoes that had perhaps passed under the target without exploding, since obviously it was rather difficult to observe from a submarine, but from a total of 13 engagements, getting at least 7 kills was a massive step up compared to the fleet average for the time, which was about a 10% success rate. The Torpex warhead certainly helped, as single hits were now proving more than capable of sinking ships that before might only have been damaged. Production numbers on torpedoes had also remained low, and a number of submarines, as they had done in late 1942, had resorted to going to sea and mining areas instead. But back at Pearl Harbor, new tactics were being developed, combining radar, new ship-to-ship voice radio, and a number of other factors to facilitate wolfpack tactics. The only things that were missing now were enough submarines to form a wolfpack and enough torpedoes to arm them all. Still, practice exercises were being held in the waters around Pearl Harbor to familiarise the crews with the operational concept. To prevent further casualties in what had become a rather alarming rise in sinking Japanese ships raking the conning towers of submarines with machine gun fire, the new conning towers were going to be built with thicker plates and using STS steel, with additional STS plates sent out to be refitted to the older subs as soon as possible. May would be a month fortunately lacking in friendly submarine losses, and would see Wahoo conduct the bulk of her 5th patrol. But first we'll consider a daring mission by USS Nautilus and USS Narwhal, both some of the bigger pre-war subs. But whereas Argonaut had been turned into a mine layer, these two were now being used as underwater troop transports of all things. In this particular case, the 7th Scout Company was split between them, loaded aboard, and the submarines set off for Attu. This was not without issues. The additional men on board meant that the submarine's oxygen reserves and CO2 absorbers were rapidly exhausted, forcing the men to go through periods of mild CO2 poisoning before it was safe for the submarines to surface and get more fresh air. Both submarines, however, managed to land their scouting forces several hours ahead of the main invasion force before heading off for safety. Overall, the numbers of sinkings of Japanese ships were going up, but this was more the result of more and more submarines coming online, as throwing enough torpedoes at things meant that some would work out after all. For contrast, in the Atlantic, Dönitz was occasionally complaining when his U-boats' torpedoes fired versus torpedoes hit ratio climbed above a 2-to-1 average. In the 1943 Pacific campaign, the ratio of torpedoes fired versus successful hits was about 11-to-1. However, in something of an ironic twist, May 1943 would become seen as the month where the U-boats' rising threat was broken in the Atlantic, with almost 4 dozen U-boats sunk, whereas in the Pacific, May would prove to be the beginning of the end for the Japanese merchant fleet, although they didn't know it yet. In part, this was down to Wahoo's patrol. It opened after escorting Nautilus and Narwhal to Attu with an attack on an aircraft tender. 3 torpedoes, 1 hit, which was a dud. Then 10 more torpedoes were fired at 2 targets, netting a single working hit that sank Tamon Maru 5. Then an attack on a 3-ship convoy. 3 torpedoes launched, 1 exploded early, which knocked the second one off course, and the 3rd hit, but was a dud again. A break in the pattern then came from a 6-torpedo spread that netted 3 hits that sank the Takao Maru and the Jimu Maru. But then a final attack on 2 ships saw 4 torpedoes fired, 2 misses, 1 dud, and 1 curious partial detonation. Another torpedo was fired to finish off the damaged vessel, and the torpedo sank. The very last torpedo aboard the boat was then fired from a stern tube, which resulted in another partial explosion. With no torpedoes left, Wahoo put on full speed for home, with an irate Morton ready to march into Lockwood's office and tell him just what he thought about the fancy Mark 6 exploder. Whilst the sub sped back home, the ex-Wahoo officer George Grider was unknowingly, possibly, saving the future assault on Tarawa. Aboard Pollack, he put 3 torpedoes out of 4 into the Bangkok Maru, sending it to the bottom. This deprived the 4,000-man garrison on Tarawa of 1,200 heavily armed reinforcements, which might well have made a significant difference in the assault on the island that was due in November 1943, considering how close that was at times. The meeting between Morton and Lockwood was loud, to say the least. Wahoo was still the best performing sub in the fleet and was now scheduled for a long overhaul back on the US West Coast, with plenty of medals and pay for the long-suffering crew. The submarine would get new batteries, refitted engines, better radar, hydrophones, a replacement prop shaft, and a cut-down and strengthened conning tower. O'Kane, however, would take Wahoo into port for the last time, as he'd been given notice that he was being promoted to command a new submarine, USS Tang. Lockwood, after surviving Morton, also received more backup to his campaign to get the submarine's larger deck guns when USS Plunger reported putting 180 rounds of 3-inch shell into the 7,400-ton Asaka Maru, followed by 1,000 rounds of 20mm, which left the ship afire, but still afloat. And finally, for this episode at least, we reached June, halfway point of the year. This month would see 2 losses. One, the R-12, was on a training mission off of Florida when the forward battery compartment flooded, taking R-12 down with 42 out of the 47 men aboard within 30 seconds. The other was potentially the USS Runner, which was lost in a time window that covers the end of June and the beginning of July, with her earliest potential date of loss being to Imperial Japanese Navy escort ships on the 22nd following a successful attack on the Sainan Maru. The 10th of June brought another failed strike on a carrier, this one Hio. USS Trigger pulled off a textbook attack with all 6 forward torpedo tubes, only to get a premature explosion, a dud, 2 misses, and finally 2 hits, or possibly very, very near prematures. These damaged Hio and sent her back into port, but 4 solid hits would almost certainly have sunk her. Theories abounded amongst the US subfleet. Had the Japanese deliberately over-magnetized their hulls to force the torpedoes to detonate early? Were they perhaps running electrified paravanes that had their own magnetic signature away from the ships? Well, most in the fleet had already guessed the truth. The Mark 6 exploder was simply faulty. This, and Morton's tirade, finally gave Admiral Lockwood the impetus to call a vote amongst his torpedo experts. They voted to a man to deactivate the magnetic portion of the Mark 6 exploder. But to order all his submarines to do this, he needed permission from Admiral Nimitz. After going over the evidence, permission was given, and Pacific Fleet submarines finally received definite orders to deactivate the magnetic element of the Mark 6 exploder on the 24th of June 1943. An unfortunate footnote to this was that the Southwest Pacific submarines, Lockwood's old command and technically separate from Nimitz's command area, were under the control of Rear Admiral Christie, who had been one of the minds that had developed the Mark 6. He ordered his submarines to keep the Mark 6 activated, which would lead to almost another year of frustration for the submarines assigned to that area. Plus, Christie had an annoying habit of relieving of command any submarine officer who said anything negative about his exploder. But for at least some of the US submarine force, they could now rely on the Mark 14 to normally run at approximately the correct depth and not prematurely detonate. It was just a pity that the contact detonator was just as bad as the magnetic one, but that was an issue to be solved in the latter half of 1943. Also around this time, test versions of the new electric Mark 18 torpedo had arrived. This was basically a US copy of the German G7E electric torpedo, but unfortunately in passing through development, someone had decided they were going to improve it, which set off another cavalcade of issues which we'll explore later as the war goes on.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.